Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mr. Fazzini, and this project, in conjunction with Mr. Doyle's Communication Center project, is a joint venture bringing to you, our ever-faithful and ever-loving audience, Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales are one of those canonical texts, and what I mean by canonical texts, they're passed down from generation to generation, and they're put in these huge, giant books and studied by students in high schools and universities across the country and read for enjoyment and scholarship. And somewhere along the line, experts have agreed that these texts are valuable. These texts help to create our cultural identity. And these texts aren't just important from a literary point of view. These texts are important to put things in a bit of a historical context. One of the great things about literature is it teaches us where we come from. It helps us to get a snapshot at societies from days gone by, and it helps us to get a view of the way people actually lived back then. One of the more valuable aspects of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is the fact that Chaucer presents these tales to us in what's called a frame story. And a frame story, one of those types of literature that I'll be discussing later, is basically a tale within a tale. And some of the freedom that Chaucer gets from using that method is that he's able to present a wide variety of personalities, a wide variety of different people. And even though it's Chaucer who's writing these tales about 28 pilgrims plus a host going to Canterbury Cathedral for their pilgrimage, what we actually get is 29 distinctive personalities, each of whom has a story to tell, and each of whom has a distinct and separate reason for going to the shrine of Sir Thomas à Becket. A little bit of historical context about the Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales came about not just because Chaucer was certainly well-versed in the literature of his day. I mean, many of Chaucer's primary sources included Boccaccio and Petrarch, two famous authors from whom Chaucer got information which informed his Knight's Tale and Miller's Tale and Reeve's Tale. But Chaucer was also very well read. He knew Latin, he'd been abroad, he fought in wars, and he was able to bring with him that sensibility that comes from doing these different things and experiencing life firsthand. So Chaucer brought with him his book learning, his knowledge of the world, the larger context of the world, and Chaucer read the Bible, and he fully assimilated these Gospels. And also Dante was a very important precursor to Chaucer. So Dantes Inferno, in his Divine Comedy, this other sort of pilgrimage in which Dante's traveler actually travels through hell and experiences the 9 circles of hell, in a story with which many people may be familiar, kind of informs, and Chaucer makes subtle allusions to that throughout the Canterbury Tales. And his own pilgrimage is far less epic and grand in stature. But Chaucer has a different reason for writing the Canterbury Tales than Dante does his Inferno. One of the literary gifts that Chaucer certainly possesses that many of his precursors, the Boccaccios, the Petrarchs, and the Dantes certainly, Chaucer has the gift of humor. And humor is very important in the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer uses satire throughout. Chaucer uses irony, both overt and subtle, throughout, to characterize his pilgrims and constantly maintain, in his general prologue, a tension between telling you what to think about certain characters by his portrayal and also allowing the audience to make up their own mind about what these characters were like, about their motivations, about the way they live their lives, and about why they are traveling for their individual, unique pilgrimage. As such, every man in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is noted according to his degree. And degree is different from the idea of social class. We've taken social class in the 20th century and 21st century to be a distinction between economic ranks, the high, the middle, and the low. In Chaucer's day and age, society was ranked somewhat differently. Certainly, with the latter stages of feudalism, there emerged a new mercantile class with newfound spending power and new kind of economic freedom. But Chaucer's idea of degree was different from just simply delineating people by social class and social status. So Chaucer, through his frame story and through this idea that these 29 pilgrims are going to go to the shrine of Sir Thomas à Becket, this martyred saint, and they're each going to tell stories when they go, on their way. His original intention was for them to tell 2 stories on the way there and 2 stories on the way back. And although Chaucer never got to finish his masterpiece, what we do get in the general prologue is a great view and a great snapshot of life as it was back then, as Chaucer depicted it. So by depicting a wide variety of individuals from all stations of life, we get a richly plotted and richly intertwined snapshot of medieval life.
When that April with his surest sorta, the drocht of March hath pierced to the rota, and bathed every vein in switch liquor, of which virtue engendered is the floor. When Zephyrus ache with his sweet breath inspired hath in every halt and heath, tender Cropus, and the younger Suna hath in the ram his halve corsirona, and smalle Fulus maken melodie, that slepen all the night with open ear, so pricket hem natuur in her courages, dan longen folk to gon on pilgrimages, and palmeres for to seken strange strondes, to ferne halwes, couth in sundry londes.
When April with his showers sweet with fruit, the drought of March has pierced unto the root, and bathed each vein with liquor that has power to generate therein and sire the flower. When Zephyr also has, with his sweet breath, quickened again in every holt and heath, the tender shoots and buds, and the young sun into the ram one half his course has run, and many little birds make melody that sleep through all the night with open eye. So nature pricks them on to ramp and rage. Then do folk long to go on pilgrimage, and palmers to go seeking out strange strands to distant shrines well known in sundry lands. And specially from every shire's end of England they to Canterbury wend, the holy blessed martyr there to seek, who helped them when they lay so ill and weal. Befell that in that season, on a day in Southwark at the Tabard, as I lay ready to start upon my pilgrimage to Canterbury, full of devout homage, there came at nightfall to that hostelry some 29 in a company of sundry persons who had chanced to fall in fellowship, and pilgrims were they all that toward Canterbury town would ride. The rooms and stables spacious were and wide, and well we there were eased, and of the best. And briefly, when the sun had gone to rest, so had I spoken with them, every one, that I was of their fellowship anon, and made agreement that we'd early rise to take the road, as you I will apprise. But none the less, whilst I have time and space, before yet farther in this tale I pace, it seems to me accordant with reason to inform you of the state of every one of all of these as it appeared to me, and who they were, and what was their degree, and even how arrayed there at the inn, and with a night thus I first will begin.
One of the things that we do need to discuss when discussing Chaucer is his use of the vernacular. The vernacular, quite simply, is the use of the common tongue. It's a language that's native to or commonly spoken by people indigenous to a certain region. And what Chaucer does throughout the Canterbury Tales is he uses kind of subtle syntactic methods to delineate and differentiate between the people who are speaking. For instance, in the Knight's Tale, after Chaucer's general prologue, our first tale is of a knight. So in the Knight's Tale, the elevated nature of the speech is going to be different from some of the members of the lower class, like the miller and the reeve, who use different patterns of speech, who use different words, and who construct their sentences differently. And Chaucer's trying to do that to let us know that these are different people speaking. Chaucer, the author, puts everything together, but frames these things with a good deal of what's called verisimilitude. Verisimilitude, quite simply, is the appearance of reality. So when we talk about verisimilitude in literature, something with what Charles Dickens was very good at, it's the act of being real, or the appearance of reality. So Chaucer, one of the ways he gets that across is by having his characters, by having his pilgrims speak in a way that they would actually speak. The knight's using this elevated tale to tell of these far-off kind of romantic adventures. And the miller and the reeve, who are telling dirty stories, are using lower vernacular, are using a language that uses the vocabulary of the common man. So what's Chaucer's point? Why does he write this Canterbury Tales, and what's he trying to do? One of the things that's important to realize is this idea of satire. And why do people write satire? Well, satire is commonly written to expose the vice, the folly, or the stupidity of a certain individual or a certain social class or a certain, political class. And we see a lot of political satire today to expose the vice, the folly, and the stupidity of certain elected officials. And Chaucer's satire sometimes is overt, like when he's going after the clergy, and sometimes it's a little more subtle. Sometimes his subtle use of satire and these satirical devices leaves us uneasy and leaves us kind of unsure about what he's actually making fun of and when. So how does Chaucer set this up? As I mentioned before, the Canterbury Tales is a frame story. And a frame story, quite simply, is a tale within a tale. Chaucer sets up his Canterbury Tales to be people telling these different stories on their way to the shrine of Sir Thomas of Becket. But each one of these pilgrims has a different tale to tell. As such, we get different plots and we get different themes interwoven within the context of this larger frame story. 1001 Arabian Nights is a good example of this. So that's something with which students may be familiar. So 1001 Arabian Nights, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves and all that, that's an example of a frame story. There's a bigger story with many other stories in between, hopefully locking together and interlinking to form one cohesive whole.
A knight there was, and he a worthy man, who from the moment that he first began to ride about the world, loved chivalry, truth, honor, freedom, and all courtesy. Full worthy was he in his liege lord's war, and therein had he ridden no more far. As well in Christendom as he heatheness, and honored everywhere for worthiness. At Alexandria he went in and was won. Full oft of the tables rostered he begun, above all nations, knights in Prussia. In Latvia rated he and Russia. No Christian man so aught of his degree. In far Granada at the siege was he, of Algeciras and in Belmarie. At Ayas was he, and at Sadali, when they were won, and on the middle sea. At many a noble meeting chanced to be, of mortal battles he had fought 15. And he'd fought for our faith at Tramacene 3 times in lists, and each time slain his foe. This self-same worthy knight had been also at one time with the Lord of Palatine against another heathen in Turkey. And always won he sovereign fame for prize. Though so illustrious he was very wise, and bore himself as meekly as a maid. He never yet had any vileness said, in all his life, to whatsoever wight. He was a truly perfect gentle knight. But now, to tell you all of his array, his steeds were good, but yet he was not gay. A simple fustian where he had juppen, Sally discolored by his habergun, for he had lately come from his voyage, and now was going on this pilgrimage.
The historical context of the Canterbury Tales is particularly interesting. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the Middle Ages, a man of a variety of occupations, having done everything from government work to education work to his own writing, chooses to write a piece that accents the difficulties in his society. He begins the writing by creating a frame tale, and that frame tale, of course, is of 30 pilgrims going to the tomb of Thomas of Becket at Canterbury on their yearly pilgrimage. And these 30 pilgrims each make the decision that they will, in fact, read or present 2 stories on the way to Canterbury and 2 stories on the way back. That meaning a total of 120 stories would be in the final version of the Canterbury Tales, along with individual prologues to introduce each story as part of the frame, and the general prologue to introduce all of the characters. Chaucer, of course, never completed this work. It's a gigantic undertaking, and he never did complete that work. And only a small portion of those final stories have been completed, and even a fewer number of those with full, complete prologues. But Chaucer does, in fact, make an effort to explore in each of those stories a different facet of his thinking about the time. What's interesting is his use of the narrator in these particular stories, so that Chaucer is the writer who is in fact narrating a piece where he's corresponding or writing or nesting these individual prologues and stories through his own language. He's the writer of the stories, but there is in fact another speaker who is telling the story inside the tale. And yet within that, we need to remember that Chaucer is in fact the storyteller, that he's the voice behind the puppet of the characters he's created, and that each of those characters who is speaking is in fact their own individual only so far as they are part of Chaucer's imagination.
The miller was a stout churl, be it known, hardy and big of brawn and big of bone, which was well proved, for when he went out on lamb at wrestling, never failed he of the ram. He was a chunky fellow, broad of build, he'd have a door from hinges if he willed, or break it through by running with his head. His beard as any sower fox was red, and broad it was as if it were a spade. Upon the coping of his nose he had a wart, and thereon stood a tuft of hairs, red as the bristles in an old sow's ears. His nostrils they were black and very wide. A sword and buckler bore he by his side. His mouth was like a furnace, door for size. He was a jester and could poetize. But mostly of all of sin and ribaldries, he could steal corn and full thrice charge his fees. And yet he had a thumb of gold begad, a white coat and blue hood he wore, this lad. A bagpipe he could blow well, be it known, and with that same he brought us out of town.
One of Chaucer's geniuses is his ability to mix genres within the context of this larger estate's satire and this larger interwoven Canterbury Tales. So Chaucer is good at telling dirty stories. Chaucer's good at these big epic romances, and Chaucer's good at satire. So let's break it down and talk about which each one actually is and where these are kind of exemplified or illustrated in the Canterbury Tales. In the Canterbury Tales, we're going to start off by talking about something called a fabliau. And a fabliau, despite its fancy and French-sounding name, is actually just a fancy way of saying a dirty story. And these dirty stories are filled with sexual innuendo, not even innuendo, I mean overt mention of sexuality and sexual practices, jokes concerning flatulence, lechery, drunkenness, public drunkenness, and all of that other stuff. So we see these things illustrated most clearly in the Miller's Tale and in the Reeve's Tale in the Canterbury Tales. Romance, another one of the genres with which Chaucer was familiar and certainly capable, is most clearly illustrated by the Knight's Tale. Romance is a word we've kind of misappropriated in the 20th and 21st century. We've taken the word romance to mean something that involves passionate love affairs. Well, it's not just that. Originally, the word romance was used to talk about like Arthurian romance. King Arthur, Sir Thomas Malory in his Morte d'Arthur wrote a romance, which is this tale of epic kings and these fantastic journeys and, overcoming great odds and all of that business. And it's a long medieval narrative. It could be in prose, as is Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur, or it could be in verse. So let's take a look at two specific examples of romance and discuss, how it could be in prose on the one hand, in verse on another, and still address the same themes. Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur in medieval times was a tale in prose talking about King Arthur and the legends of King Arthur. How we get many of our legends and our understanding of King Arthur's Sword in the Stone and Excalibur and all of that is through Thomas Malory and his Arthurian legends. Now, in the 18th, 19th century, in the 19th century, in Victorian England, Alfred Lord Tennyson, poet laureate, wrote The Idylls of the King. And in Tennyson's romance, his own version of the Arthurian legends, he writes in this gorgeously ornate language, in verse, some similar tales, explaining and expanding upon many of the things that Malory discussed in Morte d'Arthur. So two different ages, vastly different methods of getting the story across, but still this idea of romance across genres and across verse forms. The other thing that we're going to discuss with Chaucer is the estate's satire. And you can't escape Chaucer, and you can't escape a discussion about Chaucer without discussing the estate's satire. The three estates we'll be discussing in a minute, but representatives of each one of these estates, or each one of these classes, from the king on down, had various abuses or various vices that were considered to be unique or indicative of that particular estate, degree, or class. What Chaucer does in the Canterbury Tales is weave in some elements of this estate satire, and he points out the flaws and the abuses of power that are indicative of, or sometimes stereotypical of, these various degrees and classes.
There was also a nun, a prioress, who in her smiling modest was and coy. Her greatest oath was but by St. Elroy, and she was known as Madame Eglantine. Full well she sang the services divine, intoning through her nose becomingly, and fair she spoke her French, and fluently, after the school of Stratford at the Bow, for French of Paris was not hers to know. At table she had been well taught and withal, and never from her lips let morsels fall, nor dipped her fingers deep in sauce, but ate with so much care for the food upon her plate, that never driplet fell upon her breast. In courtesy she had delight and zest. Her upper lip was always wiped so clean, that in her was no iota seen of grease when she had drunk her draught of wine. Becomingly she reached for meat to dine, and certainly delighting in good sport, she was right pleasant, amiable, in short. She was at pains to counterfeit the look of courtliness and stately manners took, and would be held worthy of reverence. But to something of her moral sense, she was so charitable and piteous that she would weep if she saw but a mouse caught in a trap, though it were dead or bled. She had some little dogs too, that she fed on roasted flesh or milk and fine white bread. But sore she'd weep if one of them were dead, or if men smote it with a rod to smart, for pity ruled her and her tender heart. Right decorous her pleated wimple was, her nose was fine, her eyes were blue as glass, her mouth was small and therewith soft and red, but certainly she had a fair forehead. It was almost a full span broad, I own, for truth to tell she was not undergrown. Neat was her cloak, as I was well aware, of coral small about her she bare, a string of beads engouted all with green, and therefrom hung a brooch of golden sheen, whereon there was first written a crowned A, and under a more Vincent omnia.
One of the most interesting facets of Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales is his use of irony. We can see that use of irony throughout the tales, from the beginning in the general prologue through the individual story prologues and the individual stories that he writes from each character's perspective. The irony exists to allow the reader to have a sense of discontinuity so that we might engage as readers with the text, trying to determine what Chaucer is actually saying. In addition, it allows him to, on the surface, say one thing while underneath saying something quite different about both the characters and the society that they live in. Irony is in fact often defined as the opposite of what is expected to happen, or when we see something that is not necessarily what we thought it was. But in fact, irony in language is when the surface meaning of a language is not necessarily what the language is intended to mean underneath. And so Chaucer uses languages like when he's responding to the wife of Bath, that she is a worthy woman, and yet after that it talks about how many husbands she's had. The term worthy, which is a loaded moral term in the society Chaucer is writing in, is in direct conflict with the idea of the wife of Bath having multiple husbands over time, and that she might be a flirt or sexually promiscuous within those married relationships. That sense of worthy and yet the underlying sense that there might be something else happen means that the word worthy becomes ironic. In addition, we see that the prioress or the nun is referenced as a woman who is charitable, and yet she shows some kind of sympathy for animals when they're hurt or when they don't get their food properly, and which is in direct conflict with what the other behaviors she exhibits are. That discontinuity of behaviors, the differences, the conflicts, and the contrasts in the language is in fact the kind of irony that Chaucer uses to elicit the idea that in fact these characters may not be as they appear, and we should look more closely at their behavior. Chaucer's assault against the religious leadership and the religious hypocrisy is then shown through the use of irony, which in a way is almost like hypocritical language. We see the use of irony even more profoundly in The Wife of Bath's tale, where the wife of Bath tells a story of a knight who in fact has raped a woman and done all sorts of horrible behaviors, so that he could learn the lesson eventually that in fact women should be in charge. Women should have sovereignty over men and their lovers. Yet at the end of the story, Chaucer allows this knight who's done these horrible acts to have the same kind of authority over women that he supposedly has learned to give to those women. He undercuts the very lesson that he's telling, so that the Wife of Bath's story, although presented in a way to show that women should have authority, in fact is ironic because once we examine it closely, we discover, in fact, she may not really be giving that authority to the women in the story, and men may be retaining power. And what surface courtliness we may present in the Middle Ages may in fact not be real courtliness underneath. Irony is a directed tool which also builds into satire, which is another component of his work.
The reeve he was a slender, choleric man, who shaved his beard as close as razor can. His hair was cut round even with his ears. His top was tonsured like a puppeteer's. Long were his legs, and they were very lean, and they were like a staff with no calf to be seen. Well could he manage granary and bin, no auditor could ever on him win. He could foretell by drought and by the rain the yielding of his seed and of his grain. His lord's sheep and his oxen and his dairy, his swine and horses and all his stores, his poultry were wholly in the steward's managing. And by agreement he'd made reckoning, since his young lord of age was 20 years, yet no man ever found him in arrears. There was no agent, hind or herd, who'd cheat, though he knew well his cunning and deceit. They were afraid of him as of the death. His cottage was a good one on a heath, by green trees shaded with this dwelling place. Much better than his lord could he purchase. Right rich he was in his own private right, seeing he'd please his lord by day or night, by giving him or lending of his goods, and so got thanked, but yet got coats and hoods. In youth he'd learned a good trade, and had been a carpenter, as fine as could be seen. The steward sat a horse that could well trot, and was all dapple gray, and was named Scott. A long surcoat of blue did he parade, and at his side he bore a rusty blade. Of Norfolk was this reeve, of whom I tell, from near a town that men called Baldwell. Bundled he was like friar from chin to croup, and ever he rode hindmost of our troop.
So now that we understand what an estate satire is, and now that we've talked a little about some of the genres that Chaucer uses in the Canterbury Tales, let's just take a second and talk about what the estates actually were. So we're separating society by estate, not by class. So the first estate is the church or the clergy. The second estate is the nobility. In Anglo-Saxon times, which were before medieval times, kings had thanes fight for them. And these were people who fought for not just the honor and nobility of fighting for their king, but they fought for money and they fought for land. With the displacement of the Anglo-Saxon nobility by the 1066 Norman invasion, a new system of government took over. And this new system of government was feudalism. And under William the Conqueror, he disinherited and wiped out the title of the landed Anglo-Saxon nobility, and with his new Norman system of government, this new feudal system of government, brought in a whole new class of people and brought in a whole new people to take over the towns and the shires. So William the Conqueror distributes this land amongst his followers and gives it to them. And to that end, they become the new nobility. So there's a lot of tension between the Anglo-Saxon old nobility and the new nobility of the Normans that William the Conqueror brought in. So the second estate is the nobility. These are the knights and these are the guys who fight. The third estate, quite simply, is the peasantry. The peasantry includes everyone else. If you're not a member of the church or the clergy and you're not one of the nobility, you're a member of the peasantry. So our three estates, the clergy, those who pray, the second, those who fight, the third, everyone else.
With him there rode a gentle partner of Roncesvalles, his friend and his compeer. Straight from the court of Rome had journeyed he. Loudly he sang, "Come hither, love, come to me." The summiter joining with a burden round, was never horn a half so great a sound. This partner had hair as yellow as wax, but lank it hung as does a strike of flax. In wisp hung down such locks as he'd on head, and with them he his shoulders overspread. But thin they dropped and stringy one by one. But as to hood, for sport of it, he'd none, though it was packed in wallet all the while. It seemed to him he went in latest style, disheveled, save for cap, his head all bare. As shiny eyes he had as a hare. He had a fine veronica sewed to cap. His wallet lay before him in his lap, stuffed full of pardons brought from Rome all hot. A voice he had that bleated like a goat. No beard had he, nor ever should he have, for smooth his face had he just had a shave. I think he was a gelding or a mare. But in his craft, from Berwick unto Ware, was no such pardoner in any place. For in his bag he had a pillowcase, the which, he said, was Our Lady's true veil. He said he had a piece of the very sail that good St. Peter had, what time he went upon the sea, till Jesus changed his bent. He had a lenten cross set full of stones, and in a bottle he had some pig's bones. But with these relics, when he came upon some simple parson, then this paragon, in that one day more money stood to gain than the poor dupe in 2 months could attain. And thus, with flattery and such like japes, he made the parson and the rest his apes. But yet, to tell the whole truth at the last, he was, in church, a fine ecclesiast. Well could he read a lesson or a story, but best of all he sang an offertory. For well he knew that when that song was sung, that might he preach, and all was with polished tongue, to win some silver as he right well could. Therefore he sang so merrily and so loud.
There was a housewife come from Bath or near, who sad to say was deaf in either ear. At making cloth she had so great a bent, she bettered those of Europe and even of Ghent. And all the parish there was no good wife should offering make before her, on my life. And if one did indeed so wroth was she, it put her out of all her charity. Her kerchiefs were of finest weaven ground, I dare swear that they weighed a full 10 pound, which of a Sunday she wore on her head. Her hose were of the choicest scarlet red, close gartered, and her shoes were soft and new. Bold was her face, and fair and red of hue. She'd been respectable throughout her life, with 5 churched husbands, bringing joy and strife, not counting other company in youth, but thereof there's no need to speak in truth. 3 times she'd journeyed to Jerusalem, and many a foreign stream she had to stem. At Rome she'd been, and she'd been in Boulogne, in Spain, Santiago, and at Cologne. She could tell much of wandering by the way. Gap-toothed was she, it is no lie to say, upon an ambler easy she sat, well wimpled and over all a hat, as broad as is a buckler or a targ. A rug was tucked around her buttocks large, and on her feet a pair of sharpened spurs. In company well could she laugh her slurs. The remedies of love she knew, perchance, for of that art she'd learned the old dance.
Geoffrey Chaucer was one of the first poets in the English language to write in iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter, quite simply, is a 10-syllable line written in iambs. English is a naturally iambic language, and an iamb is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, and that's a metrical foot. So there are 5 feet of these iambs in a line of iambic pentameter. This is something that we will hear throughout our program today when we have students reading excerpts from the general prologue, when you see the Wife of Bath's tale and see the Pardoner's tale as presented by my classes, and when you hear the Chaucer read in the original Middle English in the clip that will follow. So, Chaucer writes in iambic pentameter. He also is one of the first to use what's known as the heroic couplet. And the heroic couplet is just simply rhymed lines of iambic pentameter. A couplet, 2 lines, iambic pentameter, 10-syllable line, written in iambs. Many poets through the ages have used the heroic couplet in order to write their poems, and this gives it kind of a more elevated feel. So, Alexander Pope, when he's writing The Rape of the Lock, chooses to follow Chaucer's method and chooses to follow kind of his template, and also writes The Rape of the Lock in this heroic couplet, these rhymed lines of iambic pentameter. In Middle English, which as you will hear is somewhat different sounding from the English we currently use today, in Chaucer's day and age, from 1340 to 1400, English was becoming more standardized. We're going to be discussing in a bit some of the ways Chaucer had some flexibility with the syntax of the language. And you've heard earlier how Chaucer uses these different characters and the vernacular to use different words. in the language. So, as English becomes more standardized, one of the things that's important to consider is that the pronunciation of many of these words in Middle English were different from the way we pronounce them today. Middle English isn't Old English, and Old English is the language of Beowulf, which has many more commonalities with the German language than it does contemporary modern English. Middle English kind of falls in between. So in England in this time period, feudalism was still going, but it was kind of dying out, and some of the French influence was dying out. So people wanted their native tongue. Consequently, English became more standardized. So Chaucer has some choices to make when he's writing the Canterbury Tales. Why would anyone ever sit down and write a lengthy piece, such as the Canterbury Tales, in verse? Why not just write it in prose? Well, there are many reasons for this. And in Shakespeare, when we start discussing Shakespeare and we talk about him, you get the feeling that the verse gives it a more elevated feeling. The verse ties everything together. The verse gives it a rhythm. The verse gives it a meter. The verse gives it a quality that you simply cannot express in prose. And what Chaucer has to do is called versification. Versification, quite simply, is the act of putting something into verse. It's the formation of metrical structures. It's what allows us to not only write poetry, but also kind of understand and comprehend and analyze what's going on when we look at a line of poetry.
Masters, quoth he, here now is my advice, but take it not, I pray you, in disdain. This is the point, to put it short and plain, that each of you, beguiling the long day, shall tell 2 stories as you wend your way to Canterbury town, and each of you, on coming home, shall tell another 2. All of adventures he has known befall, and he who plays his part the best of all, that is to say, who tells upon the road, tales of best sense in most amusing mode, shall have a supper at the other's cost, here in this room and sitting by this post, when we come back again from Canterbury. And now, the more warrant you'll be merry, I will myself and gladly with you ride at my own cost, and I will be your guide. But whosoever shall my rule gainsay, shall pay for all that's bought along the way. And if you are agreed that it is be so, tell me at once, or if not, tell me no, and I will act accordingly, no more. This thing was granted, and our oaths we swore, with right glad hearts, and prayed of him also, that he would take the office, nor forgo the place of governor of all of us, judging our tales, and by his wisdom thus arranged that a supper at a certain price we to be ruled each one by his advice, in things both great and small. By one assent we stood, committed to his government. And thereupon the wine was fetched anon. We drank, and then to rest went every one. And then without a longer tarrying, next morning when the day began to spring, uprose our host, and acting as our cock, he gathered us together in a flock. And forth we rode, a jog-trot being the pace, until we reached St. Thomas's watering place. And there our host pulled horse up to a walk, and said, now, masters, listen while I talk. You know what you agreed at set of sun, if even song and morning song are one. Let's here decide who first shall tell a tale, and as I hope to drink more wine and ale, whoso provides, proves rebel to my government, shall pay for all that by his way is spent. Now, come now, draw cuts before we farther win, and he that draws the shortest shall begin. Sir Knight, said he, my master and my lord, you shall draw first, as you have pledged your word. Come near, quoth he, my lady prioress, and you, sir clerk, by your bashfulness. Nor ponder more, out hands flow every man. At one straw cut each one began. And, to make short the matter, as it was, whether by chance or whatsoever cause, the truth is, that the cut fell to the knight, at which right happy then was every wight. Thus, that is, the story first of all he'd tell, according to the compact it befell. As you have heard, why argue to and fro? And when this good man saw that it was so, being wise man, and obedient to plighted word, given by free assent, he slid. Since I must begin the game, why, welcome be the cut, and in God's name, now let's ride and hearken what I say. And at that word we rode forth on our way. And he began to speak with right good cheer, his tale anon, as it is written here.
One of the difficulties students have when studying poetry and when reading poetry is sometimes that authors will invert the syntax. Syntax, quite simply, means sentence structure. And the traditional modern English syntax is subject, verb, object. Okay, what do I mean? Eric, subject, ate, verb, bacon, object. Eric ate bacon. That's a traditional English, modern English way of saying a particular sentence. However, what Chaucer does many times throughout the Canterbury Tales is he inverts the syntax. Sometimes that can take the part of object, subject, verb. Let me read you an example. By Christ's lore and his apostles 12, he taught. So translating that into modern English, he taught based on the teachings of Christ and his apostles. Sometimes what he does is object, verb, subject. A yeoman had he. He had a yeoman. Sometimes what he does is a complement, which could be an adverb or an adjective. Complement, verb, subject. Short was his gown. Sometimes what he does in the Canterbury Tales is complement, subject, verb. Courteous he was. And sometimes the verb, subject, object construction of the language. Thus hath this piteous day a blissful end. So this piteous day has had a blissful end. So sometimes it's confusing when you're reading poetry to figure out what's happening when. But if you're conscious of and cognizant of the syntax and some of the syntactical inversions that an author is using at a particular time, especially Geoffrey Chaucer, who's writing in Middle English, just be aware that it does not have to be an impenetrable barrier for you. It doesn't have to be something that ruins your enjoyment of the Canterbury Tales. It doesn't have to be something that ruins your enjoyment of Shakespeare. The Canterbury Tales is written in this syntax that's sometimes confusing to us. Break it down. Think of who's saying what. Think of when they're saying it. And think basic subject, verb, object. Sometimes to make a line of balanced iambic pentameter, particularly if you're trying to keep this heroic couplet structure up throughout the length of pretty long text, you're going to have to make some syntactic inversions in order to make it work. So you as the student have some work to do on your part. However, the language is so rich, the plots are so enjoyable, and Chaucer's so much fun that reading the Canterbury Tales and putting forth the intellectual effort that it takes to get it, understand it, and enjoy it is well worth the effort in the end. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for spending an evening with us. I thank Mr. Doyle for allowing us to work up here with him in the lovely Communication Center at Norristown Area High School. And until next time, I'm Mr. Fazzini bidding you good night.